Okay, hi. Thank you for having me, and thank you for organizing this conference. The title of my talk, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, can be read in a multiple of ways. It could refer to the graphic work itself, good content and bad or sometimes even ugly form, or to ugly stories of oppression, silencing, and dominance. Martha Scott calls the history of women in graphic design and publishing messy, which means to look at and read the doubt, the shame, and the silences, a method I share with numerous other feminist scholars and practitioners. I find history never being simply good or bad. It's never a clean divide. It's a kaleidoscope, shifting, fragmented, and full of conflicting stories and perspectives, which is what makes it so compelling and so complicated. So I'm going to scratch some surface of my past, present, and future research with some good, bad, and ugly examples. So this is Anna Snin, Nancy Cunard, Virginia Woolf, Flora Riding, and Dora Marston, 5 women who refused to accept the patriarchal system into which they were born. In the male-dominated world of publishing, they taught themselves printing, often dismissed as amateurs and accused of not engaging in proper printing. But these women understood the power of print not merely as a technical achievement, but as a vehicle for freedom of expression, a way to challenge conventions both in content and form, and a means to intervene directly in political, social, and artistic debates. It had to do with agency. The very act of publishing often defied established norms, as Virginia Woolf stated about the purpose of her Hogarth Press: to publish small things, experimental things of any genre that regular publishers would not accept. I also believe that there are longer lines in history of the subject matter to consider. Print has long been a Pandora's box, a tool for empowerment and progress, but also oppression. Nancy Cunard wrote in the biography of her press, "These were the hours." A press is very dangerous. It means the dissemination of ideas, end quotes. One of the earliest examples of just how dangerous is the Malleus Maleficarum, published in Lyon in 1484, 30 years into the new technological paradigm of mass communication. This ultra-misogynist and terrifying publication launched a brutal campaign against women, particularly older women, loud or opinionated women, and those with knowledge in midwifery and medicine. And riffing on Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch, it was a tool for colonizing women and their bodies. Between 1484 and 1669, 36 editions were printed disseminating systematic misogyny and reinforcing the dominance of the ruling class, second to the Bible in popularity. Lies became truth as publishers profited from sensational witch-related clickbait as pamphlets, woodcuts, and broadsides, which has cast its ugly shadows over the distant side of history all the way into our time. So fast-forwarding into the industrial revolution, which transformed the production and dissemination of print, expanding access, but also raising new tensions. One significant development was the entry of women into public life and into the growing industrial workforce. Emily Faithfull, a pioneering feminist, founded the Victoria Press in 1860 and co-founded the Women's Printing Society in 1874 to train women for employment in the printing trade. These initiatives provided not only skills but also agency, access to economic independence and control over the means of production, claiming a public voice for women. Yet progress was met with resistance. Unionized typographers frequently attempted to push women out of the industry. A 1902 Norwegian typographer's periodical lamented, "It is the skirts who create such conditions. They crawl and scratch in every compartment and corner in the holy halls of Gutenberg. Few of us can cook and scrub, and if there's no change in the current conditions, we will get the disheartening sight of compositors standing by the stove while their wife and daughters work at the typecase." End quote. But we know women have always been present in printing and publishing, yet rendered invisible, often losing their names in marriage. Beatrice Ward famously described modern typography as a crystal goblet. The best printing is meant to be invisible, allowing the reader to focus entirely on the content. This ideal of invisibility goes on to the industry itself, urging us to judge the quality of work objectively without considering the life and circumstances of the people who produced it. This argument is a glass ceiling. if we look beyond singular people, but to an entire country, I think the Dunn Emer later Koala Press, run by the Yeats sisters, serves as a good example, as they used the press in search for a national identity through excellent craftsmanship, at the time being the only fine printers in Ireland in the fight for gaining independence from England. How the ideal of professionalism became surrounded by anonymity, as we have learned through the research of Fiona Ross and Alice Savoy's investigations of women in the type drawing offices, and the work of the MMS collective Natural Enemies of the Book, to mention a very few, is an interesting question. To honor the guild, the craft, and the collective is in some parts good. But this narrative hides the uglier sides, making women labor, child labor, and slavery invisible. Think it with Elizabeth Robin's words stating that you may read all the books in all the tongues of earth, con every record in clay or stone or papyrus, and still know only half the story. This tension between visibility and invisibility, freedom and oppression, is crucial to understanding the feminist stakes of the modernist presses we will examine. Virginia Woolf's entry into printing exemplifies the personal and artistic liberation that self-directed publishing offered. In 1917, denied access to St. Bride's, Woolf and her husband Leonard taught themselves printing on their kitchen table. The Mark on Wall from Two Stories was the first pamphlet she typeset, printed and bound and published herself. And during this process, Woolf wrote to her sister, "We have just finished printing Leonard's story. I have not yet written mine, but there is nothing in writing compared to printing." The Mark on the Wall is a little bit better typographically than Three Jews. The traces of their struggles are very present. Wartime constraints meant Leonard did not waste paper, not even on proofs. And it looks like in this example that I've had to add this section to accommodate the illustration on the last quarter page of the Mark on the Wall, probably due to cast-off struggles. And it took them 3 months to finish an edition of 150. The more interesting thing about the Mark on the Wall is how the story in fact reflects on the design process. It's very becoming, is a product of an author deeply involved in the becoming of the book. In the Mark on the Wall, she plays with typographic metaphors, especially the full stop, as the mark on the wall and the full stop on the page is one and the same thing. It talks of the fact that typography, metal type leaving their marks on paper, is what manifests literature. The Mark on the Wall is a reflection on how typesetting and book design is the architecture which enables us to envision and enter new rooms and realities, creating ideas to be put into existence. Woolf went on to experiment with form, particularly in this one, Hope Mealy's Paris, clearly influenced by Mallarmé and Apollinaire's typographic experiments. Yet she later abandons these more illustrative layouts due to frustration with proof correction and that it was all too time-consuming. And all her books bear witness of an impatient pair of hands. In the long poem Parallax, following Paris, written by Nancy Cunard, and The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, Woolf plays with the layout to enhance these poems, which takes us on a journey through a war-torn and fragmented Europe, with their abrupt breaks and shifting rhythms. 3 poems in clear dialogue with each other, in both content and form, which Woolf codes into her design and points out in suggesting Parallax as the title for the last of the series. Her approach was never about perfection. She explains this in response to critics. All I have to urge and excuse is that printing is a hobby carried on in the basement of a London house, that as amateurs all instructions in the art were denied us, that we have picked up what we know for ourselves, and that we practice printing in the intervals of lives that are otherwise engaged. To work with typography and book design profoundly changed Woolf's style of writing, in form directly, like her metaphorical use of punctuation, line breaks, and paragraphing, especially evident in the first self-published novel, Jacob's Room, but also in terms of what she could write about, quoting her own reflections to change style at will. And what I owe the Hogarth Press is barely paid by the whole of my handwriting. I am the only woman in England free to write what I like, end quote. The Hogarth Press was primarily interested in publishing. Though maintaining a visually appealing format, it was never concerned with fine printing, as Woolf reflected on the fact that proper printing would devour one's entire life. The Hogwarts Press went on to publish an extraordinary number of works and inspired others, including Nancy Cunard and Laura Riding, to pursue their own presses. So a decade later, Nancy Cunard, heiress, poet, artist and activist, establishes the Hours Press in Paris. Cunard's entry into publishing was prompted by her exclusion from the male literary networks and her discouragement as a poet, following harsh treatment by peers like Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, who effectively pushed her out of poetry as a full-time pursuit. She hired a professional compositor with the name Monsieur Lévy, who scolded her for rejecting conventional typographic rules. And she replies him, "Consider this an experimental place whenever you're going to think of conventional rules," end quote. Though her first book, Peronic the Fool, by George Moore, is rather a conventional first move that rings with Cunard's word to Lévy. "My intention is to learn from you everything I possibly can, as quickly as may be, so as to be able to work without you." Over 4 years, Cunard hand-printed 24 books, in addition ranging from 80 to 1,000 copies. Many said of her that one would have thought she had grown up a printer, that she had ideas about printing in regard to type, size and form, which no one seems to know where she learned. She had a natural eye for good design and good printing. But Cunard admits in hindsight that she ended up being much more conventional than she had planned, quoting from a conversation with fellow poet-printer Manuel Altiger. "We went on discussing various forms and styles. To both our minds, the simplest was the best. Fair type and beautiful paper, great legibility and a sort of spareness in everything. We found out we were, in fact, purists." In 20 Poems Less, it's clear that Cunard wanted to highlight the poem itself. She was very dedicated the 4 years she ran the Hours Press, working up to 16 hours a day, quoting, "It is always twice as long as you think." And I thought handsetting was like sewing, one stitch at a time. One was like doing either to attain proficiency, end quote. Eventually, even if the Hours Press hired assistants and became very successful, Cunard abandons the press to dedicate herself to anti-fascist activism and anti-racist journalism, highlighting that for these women, printing was rarely a lifelong career, but rather a tool for political and artistic expression, a tool for breaking the silence. Laura Riding and Robert Graves founded the Sizing Press in London in 1928. Building on Riding's belief in personal possession of the means of literary production. The Sizing Press produced works not for collectors but for readers, emphasizing quality and accessibility, as they stated. "Our plan is to print necessary books by various particular people. A necessary book may be either a trouble book or a no trouble book. A trouble book is necessary trouble-taking and trouble-making. A no trouble book is necessary no trouble-taking and no trouble-making." The hand press only produced 7 books, and their first production being Love as Love, Death as Death, a 64-page collection of Riding's own poems. In 1930, Graves and Riding moved to Mallorca, but in 1935 they had to evacuate and give up the press with the coming of the Spanish Civil War, and their relationship ended. The notion of possession, incidentally appropriate to the fact of having the printing instrument, was a personal identification with the area of the activity of being the more there, end quote. Riding later reflected on the fact that the process was altogether too expensive and time-taking, prioritizing poetic work and creative engagement or extensive printing, maintaining a balance between literary ambition and the material realities of press work. Anais Nin's experience in publishing reflects similar principles of agency and control. Nin made 2 unsuccessful attempts to establish a press in 1935 and 1937, denied full authority by male collaborators. Fleeing the German invasion, she established the Gemor Press in New York in 1941, motivated by difficulty in finding publishers willing to print her work. Nin challenged commercial constraints. Uncommercial, what does that entail? Streamlining, deciding what the audience will and will not like. The machinery around it. What if the judges' tastes were different? How different the world would look. End quote. At Gemor Press, Nin printed books for herself and other authors and other presses, like Horace Crosby's The Black Psalm Press. Nin later reflected on the technical and artistic benefits of printing. Instead of using one's energy in a void, against frustrations, in anger against publishers, I use it on the press. Type, paper, a source of energy, solving problems, technical problems. And speaking of solving or not solving technical problems, you can clearly see them in this book with these very eccentric margins throughout. Which is, for me, what fuels my interest with these presses, because the material processes of literature is so present, which is so easily overlooked, like words just drops from someone's head into a perfectly produced book on its own. And Woolf reflects on this, knowing the struggles of bookmaking, which we can clearly recognize. Books are not turned out of molds like bricks. Books are made out of tiny little words which a writer shapes, often with great difficulty, into sentences of different lengths, placing one on top of another, never taking his eyes off them, sometimes building them quite quickly, at other times knocking them down in despair and beginning all over again." End quote. Although Nin eventually relinquished full control in 1946 to focus on writing, the experience of hands-on printing profoundly shaped her literary style, tightening phrasing and heightening awareness of textual form. Quoting, "After living with a page for a whole day, I could detect the superfluous words. At the end of each line, I thought, is this word, this phrase absolutely necessary?" This is Dora Marston, which exemplifies radical editorial intervention prior to many of the author-printers of the interwar period. Though she did not physically print text herself, she was, together with Mary Gawthorpe from Leeds, founder and editor of The Free Woman. After Gawthorpe left due to force-feeding injuries, Harriet Shaw Weaver entered as financial patron of the New Free Woman, and later The Egoist, which created a critical platform for modernist literature and feminist thought. Marston was very daring, advocating equality in the home, sexual freedom, gay rights, and suffrage for all women. Marston's work involved curating, editing, and shaping text for publication, highlighting how women exerted influence in publishing even without directly handling type. And she collaborated with Harriet Shaw Weaver, who quietly financed the entire life and work of James Joyce, ensuring that these texts could reach audience despite legal and social obstacles. Marston's own philosophical work and its reception led her into severe depression, and she withdrew from the world and lived out her life isolated and institutionalized, yet financially supported by none other than Harriet Shaw Weaver, who also saw to it that her work got published. So the history of women in publishing is not a story of good or bad printing per se. It's a story of risk, defiance, loss, and survival. From Woolf's claim to literary freedom to Cunard's purist designs, from Riding's insistence on possession to Nin's typographic self-discovery, and from Marston's radical editorships to Faithfull's early fight for women in the trade. These women reminds us that print is never neutral. When the establishment failed to silence them, it instead reduced them to caricatures, discussing their hats, lovers, and private lives instead of their work, dismissed as lunatics, sexual deviants, and failures, their unconventional styles written off as incompetence. Rather, it should be recognized as acts of dissidence and a search for other voices, an attempt to create a professional and collaborative environment where serious criticism could exist. Of the 5 women central to this paper, most of them suffered gravely for daring to raise their voices against the patriarchy. Nancy Cunard, who understood the dangers of the press, saw her house looted by Nazis and all her belongings, her art, books, letters, destroyed. On finding every piece of lead type smashed with a hammer, she wrote in her diary, "How well illustrated here is that famous cry, death to the intellect. If much was left, far more was gone forever," which seemed to me the answer to the question one asks as a child, what is life going to be like? End quote. And from this she never recovered. To gain control of the press cut both ways. It opened spaces for women to whom I owe a deep gratitude, yet it also exposed them to relentless attempts at erasure, which they paid for with their health, wealth, and sanity. So I think we shouldn't measure printing only by its technical perfection, but by its capacity to hold space for expression, resistance, and inclusivity. The women who dared to pick up the composing stick did not always play by the rules, but in breaking them, they showed us the good in the bad and the ugly, and the power of agency. And I think we live in times where we need their example. When perfection is graspable, we have to ask ourselves how to design an open and inclusive future, a softer future, a future open to flaws, imperfections, and diversity, where lives are not sold as truth for profit, where we are not slaves of technology and capital interest, but free to change style at will, free to write, say, and print what we like without harming others. Thank you.